This is a nice cartoon that a friend of one of my co-authors did, which I think summarizes it up as, I don't know if you can see all the little individual bits representing different aspects of COVID-19 policies as a house of cards. Okay, so last year, for those of you who were at last year's DTP in El Paso, I gave a talk how COVID-19 public health policies neglected the disease, the patient and the physician. Now, everything I said in that, I still stand by, and but to avoid repetition, we're really focusing on a different aspect. So in that, on different points, that in there we were summarising the 3 papers that we had published at the time. But at the end of May, we just finally published a major review paper. It took us 2 years to get it done, involving 37 co-authors from 13 countries. And just so you have it, the context, these are the papers that I talked about last year. And you can see we were working on this thing since early on. We tried to get, we published a preprint. And then we were like, oh, okay. It took us, by the time we'd gotten the second round of reviews back, it was mid-2022, and all of our analysis was looking at the first year, which was focused on the non-pharmaceutical interventions. And so we said, look, let's just do new papers. And eventually we were getting these published, but we noticed other people were getting published papers that were questioning the science that we were supposed to be following. But each time they would just question one little piece of the science, and then you would have shoehorned into the paper, but everything else is perfectly fine. Just this one little aspect there's a problem with. And we recognized we were getting that pressure to get published as well. And so we started reaching out to some of the people that were publishing to say, look, you got their thing paper. Can we do a synthesis summarizing problems that we find and asking what lessons can be learned from the management of the COVID-19 pandemic. We have a lot of people in here. There's a few that DDP members will recognize that we have Jane Orient, we have Stephen Hatfill, Harvey Reich, we have Robert Malone. There's a lot of people in there that you'll recognize. And so this is one of the things is we actually felt that COVID policies affected everyone. You were there. It affected every aspect of society, and every aspect of science was impacted in some way. And so we realized that actually you can't just rely on one particular discipline. So we made sure to get the perspectives of immunologists, epidemiologists, virologists, public health practitioners, pathologists, psychologists, social scientists, data analysts. So that's a feature. We got everybody in it. So it's difficult, a little bit like herding cats, to try and put something together, but we managed to get the herd over to the destination. And so everybody, we would do it through different iterations. We would compile together all of the feedback, then we'd send it to everyone. How do we change it? And so by the end of it, everybody looked at this. Now, we'll show in it, there's different perspectives among us. We disagree with each other on different aspects. That's healthy in science, to have disagreements. But we also say that, look, other researchers disagree with us. If our opinions were already universally shared and understood, then we would not need to write this article. Right? Okay. So in it, we focus on 4 main overarching problems that we've found. And so we give a nice little summary quote that we found that we think summarized each one. But broadly, we're talking of the models, then we have the non-pharmaceutical interventions, which is basically lockdown, stay at home, masks, school closures, anything that didn't involve a pharmaceutic. And then we have the pharmaceutical interventions, the PIs. And then we have the misinformation, the suppression of what was called misinformation. Now, I realize it's 6 years. It's like It's very, very hard to remember. Back in 2019, you heard my father Michael talking about the weather balloons, and we presented at the DDP in Tucson, Arizona. It was in the same function room even. Okay, that's it. And we had no idea that we were going to be looking at, the next 5 years, things would completely change. But sure enough, March 2020, WHO declared a pandemic, international public health emergency, and they kept that in place until May 2023. And last year I gave my talk, as I said, and we are here. But it's very hard. It's like, I find it very hard to think back to life 2019. So it's like a different era. I guess you could call it before COVID or BC. Yeah. So if that was before COVID, then now we're after COVID, okay? But in this talk, I really want to talk about what happened during COVID. So really we're looking at from after COVID, we're looking at what happened during COVID, okay? So what happened during COVID? Well, a lot. What I would point out here is 2020 was the start of it. This is before the vaccines rolled out. And everything was focusing on the non-pharmaceutical interventions. And this was driven by the models, as I'll discuss later on. And you want to remember this, because a lot of people still don't realize just how influential these models were. But by 2021, we noticed there was a shift. That actually, now it was all about this new, safe and effective, novel genetic vaccine that had just been released. And so everything then shifted to, all of the policies were focused on the COVID vaccine rollout programs. And so the models, though, still had a role, but it switched to a supporting role. Now, May 2023, we say, oh, it's over, time to move on. Well, is it? I would argue no, for two reasons. Okay, the first reason is just a fundamental thing of ethics. You cannot actually, it's not right to forgive somebody that has not expressed remorse for the thing. You can't, that's not a forgiveness. You can't forgive something for something that they haven't actually expressed remorse for, fundamentally. But so also, we think that there are lessons to be learned in general. So I'm going to talk, the first bit of this is about the models. And there's this nice quote from the late Pierre Gallois, but my colleague Willie often gives this other one that I think summarizes better. GIGO, garbage in, gospel out. Okay, so now, what was this garbage that goes in? Well, it wasn't garbage, but it was, in 1927, two Scottish epidemiologists, Kermack and McKendrick, they were trying to describe certain behaviours. They were looking at why is it that you will have an outbreak of an epidemic, and that it will start to fade before the end, before everybody 100% had gotten sick. And so he said this is what's called herd immunity. So they said, well, look, can we model this mathematically? So they set up a set of differential equations. 1927, there was no computers. It was designed to be solved by pen and paper. That is, this SEIR model, or SIR model, it's the same model that was used during COVID. So every time I'm referring to the models, just remember, just add in your head, that was developed in 1927. Okay, now, I'm going to show that actually the SIR models had 5 different implications during the COVID pandemic. So let's start with the first one, which was the start. Well, actually, let's start with what is the SIR model. The original one was SIR. A lot of people add in an E. But basically, you assume new pandemic, a new virus arrives in a population everyone is equally susceptible to this new virus until they get infected. Then they become infectious, and then they infect on average an R0. Everybody remember R0? That we was like suddenly everyone was supposed to be an epidemiologist. The R0 is the average number of people that each infected person will infect before they recover. Okay, and then this model it gives you the same results pretty much for any virus, new virus, just depends on what's the R0 and then just the logistics. What's the time from E to I, the incubation period, what's the infectious period, I to R, and then what is, to understand the impacts, what is the infection fatality rate, what percentage on average of people who get infected die, hospitalized. That's it. And it was simple. You could do that with your pen and paper in 1927. And so I got this here. This is the modelling, the Irish modelling group. They published their, Gleason et al., published their SEER model for COVID. So I ran it, 1,000 runs, just looking with R0 equals 3. It actually looked at like tens of thousands of these runs, but like just showing you this one. This is what it predicts for basically a generic pandemic with an R0 of 3. And what you find is, look at this key bit here. The output is number of days since start of pandemic. It doesn't matter whether you run this model starting in June or in January. It gives you the same results. And what is the results it gives? It says, well, starts off, there's only a few, then more and more people get sick, and then you start to reach herd immunity, and then people start getting less sick. And so that is the curve that we were supposed to be flattening in 2 weeks, right? So what was this curve? It was predicting at the peak of the curve, which is 72 days after the first infection, 18% of the country would be sick and infectious. Just think through that. Just put yourself into the mind of a government advisor saying, oh my God, what are we going to do? This is the apocalypse. And they say after 90 days, 80% would have been sick at some point. 150 days, 94, everyone would have got it except for a few. And then just think through the stuff, okay? That's what people were saying. Now, they weren't sharing this to the public because then they would be terrified. But they were keeping it to themselves, and then they were doing it. So this is one of the lead modelers here, Dr. Neil Ferguson at the Imperial College, London. And so I got to talk a little bit about him. He had been working on this for a long time, the SEER models. He's been predicting a deadly pandemic for decades now. And so he, with Martin Bootsma in 2007, they decided, let's use this SEER model to look at the Spanish flu in 1918, just at the end of World War I. And they looked at how effective were the public health measures in 16 different US cities that they had weekly excess mortality for. And then they looked through the newspaper archives to find out what were the measures implemented in each city. And they said, then they ran their model, and they said, this is what should have happened without any interventions. And these are the interventions. So the difference between their model, what they call a counterfactual scenario of what would have happened without the measures, and what actually happened, must be the effect of the public health measures. Now, there's a logic there. It seems, there's also a logical fallacy there, which you can try and figure out there. But they say, oh, Spanish flu, that's history. No, they actually said the interest of this study is far from just historical. Policymakers around the world are considering how non-pharmaceutical measures can be used to contain or mitigate a future pandemic. This is in 2007. Key to decisions to be made in the coming months and years will be the evidence base for the effectiveness of such interventions. So they were saying, when the next pandemic comes, which we'll be ready because we've done our SEER model analysis. So they went and they said specifically, we identified 4 of the 16 cities did a good job. They reduced the transmission. So I'm just going to focus on one of these, Kansas City. And here it is. This is what they said should have happened without any interventions. they say one giant wave or one giant curve. It predicts peaks 60 days after the national outbreak, so on November the 6th. Remarkably precise predictions. This is what actually happened. We had one wave that peaked mid-October. Then it fell into decline, and interestingly, World War I ended in the middle. Everyone was celebrating in the Kansas City and across the world. And then we had another peak that peaked at peak cold and flu season, which, as you know, cold and flu season peaks December, January. Okay, so that doesn't look like that, does it? Right? So that's what they said should have happened without the interventions. Ergo, whatever the difference between that and that must have been the measures. That's what they claim. And so they said, well, whatever measures were in place here were 50% effective. Whatever measures were in place here were 33% effective. So what were those measures? Well, they provide this in the supplementary material. I don't know how many people actually looked at this, but they said this between the red date, October the 9th to November the 9th, so a month and 1 day, they had 50% effective measures. So what were these? Well, okay, schools closed and for a month, and children were to stay at home, no church services, some businesses were closed, funerals were private. Okay, October 14th, this is a big one, the anti-spitting law was rigidly enforced. I guess this was the time of chewing tobacco, or, but that was a big thing, apparently. So then they had the drastic ban on schools closed indefinitely, public gatherings of 20 or more. This is not as restrictive as we had for COVID, remember, 20 or more. You still had streetcars were limited, elevators and telephone booths sterilised twice. Okay, 50% effective according to Bootsman Ferguson. What about this other one? From December the 3rd to January 2nd, a month, there was 33% effective. Now that included Christmas, so the schools were closed for Christmas, but that's not an intervention. The main one, December the 3rd, the commissioners ordered children to stay away from shows. 33% effective, apparently. So this is 50% effective. So I went and I used AI to try and recreate the interventions in Kansas City in 1918. And so AI is, well, Jonathan will be talking about that later on. But apparently this is 50% effective. No spitting allowed. Okay? So this was 33% effective. Children stay away from shows. Okay, that was it. Now, he became this expert, Ferguson. So when COVID came along, he said, well, okay, can you tell us what's going to happen from COVID? So he was like, he didn't have a lot of time. He was asked to do it on the thing. So he said, I have a model. So what he did is, in 2005, he had done this SEER model for a hypothetical bird flu. Oh, there's got to be a bird flu pandemic. What if it's in a Southeast Asia country? They picked Thailand. And then if you look at the supplementary material, they do say, should you include seasonality? And they said, well, it's probably likely to be less important in the setting of Thailand, which is not true in itself. There is seasonality in the tropics, but it's different from in the mid-latitudes. But then, a year later, he republished it for US and Great Britain, and he didn't revisit that. Okay, so 2006, then he was asked what to do. This is for a hypothetical flu pandemic. Well, he said, I'll just repurpose this one and make it for COVID, and I'll plug in Verity et al.'s estimates of the IFR and hospitalization rate, which were later shown to be highly overestimated. But this is what they were predicting. On the 16th of March, he was saying by the end of May, we'd be seeing 13,000 deaths a day in Great Britain. By early June, 50,000 deaths a day in US. And by the end of the pandemic, the wave, the curve, it would all be over by September 2020. But 500,000 would have died in Great Britain and 2 million in the US. So what happened? Well, the next day, why Boris Johnson reversed Britain's virus response. The UK and US have ramped up efforts to flatten the curve of the COVID-19 pandemic. Interventions may need to be in place until a vaccine is developed, 18 months or longer. Okay, so what happened then? You say, okay, they introduced all of these measures. And then, did the apocalypse, did that occur? No. So therefore, what's the conclusion? The model predicted that should happen without the interventions. That catastrophe didn't happen. Therefore, 3 million deaths were averted due to these measures. So I don't know if you can see, this is actually a log scale from Flaxman et al. Ferguson's in there. It was published, it's submitted 30th of March, published 8th of June. And what they said is, this is the deaths with COVID. By the way, deaths with COVID includes deaths from COVID. But deaths from COVID doesn't mean the same as deaths with COVID. That's all that we have. We don't know to this day what percentage of the deaths with COVID were deaths from COVID. And that's a talk for another talk we could do. But regardless, they were saying, this is what should have happened, this is what happened. So, okay. That meant every time that there was the modelers said to the governments, jump, the government said, how high? And we then had to jump on behalf of the governments. And so what happened here is that kept going up until early 2022, when the UK were being told, the government were being told, oh, if you don't introduce more lockdowns, this is what's going to happen, the curve. And they, for some reason, somebody had developed a spine. I don't know, maybe it's contagious, because then the rest of the government started doing it. But they actually didn't introduce the interventions, and this is what happened. And yeah, you say, oh, there's deaths, but this is actually cold and flu season. So every year, there are deaths during cold and flu season. It was not this. So then people just dropped the models. Okay, it was kind of gone. But there was another thing for the models. Remember, you're predicting this apocalypse. Just put yourself in the mind of it. You were saying, what can we do? It's like a sword of Damocles hanging over us. As soon as we lift the measures, it's going to be chaos. Well, they said, well, what if we had a safe and effective vaccine? Well, then you could just vaccinate everybody, or at least 60 to 70% of the population, and bypass that, and then it would be all over. Okay, and so sure enough, 2022, Watson et al. Went and they said, oh, that apocalypse didn't occur in 2021, that must have been the vaccines. And so they assumed that the vaccines were as safe and as effective as the Pfizer and Moderna clinical trials said, which we'll get back to later. And on this basis, they said, we estimated vaccinations prevented 14.4 million deaths in worldwide between December 2020 and December 2021. That figure, by the way, to this day, if you go to the WHO's website, they say that the COVID vaccines saved at least an estimated 14.4 million lives in 2021 alone. So just when you see that, that's where it's coming from, Watson et al. And then, who funded this, by the way? Well, interesting, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who are promoting vaccines worldwide. But that's another one. Oh, who? The WHO. So they actually funded it. So maybe that's not a surprise. Now, they actually provide two estimates. The 14.4 million is based on deaths with COVID. Now, but then this is the main one they liked because it gives a higher number, which is the excess mortality. And what they say is, this is what should have happened, their counterfactual scenario. This is the observed excess mortality. And so then they say, well, all of that stuff, blue, those are the lives saved. Now, okay, it's the same thing again. What I want to just point out here is they get a similar result for the COVID deaths. They again assumed deaths with COVID equals deaths from COVID in their first analysis. But this one here, they said excess mortality. They assumed what could be the explanation for excess mortality. Only thing we can think of is COVID. Well, You know, what about the lockdowns introducing people missing cancer treatments, undiagnosed? What about suicides from depressions? Or what about the vaccine itself? Because it's interesting, you get this massive spike at the peak of the rollout. But like, that's, you know, I'm not going to say that, that's just a thought experiment. But we weren't the only ones that were criticizing the models. We were finding lots of other papers were criticizing it, but it was falling on deaf ears. And so in the paper, we look at each of these things, and we do these. You don't have time to read all of these aloud. You download the paper, you can read through them, they're justified, we go through all of the details. But on each of the problems, we draw different conclusions, and we have a corresponding recommendation. So on mathematical models, we can say models can be very powerful tools. Okay, but tools should be used to supplement, not replace empirical analysis. You know, like a chainsaw can be a very powerful tool, but you don't use that for cutting your steak at dinner. Okay? So the other thing is that their relevance and suitability should be continually revisited, and crucially, this is missing, actually assessed as time goes on. These counterfactual scenarios are the definition of non-falsifiable. I'm predicting what will happen if you don't do this. We've done it. It didn't happen. See, my model's correct. No, that's not science. That's pseudoscience. It's non-falsifiable. But anyway, models can be good tools, but not replacements. Okay, now we're on to the next problem, which is the NPIs. And again, this is stuck from the perspective of the model. Do you remember this 1927 model? There is almost no biology behind any of these things. So, but all they just wanted to do was reduce the R0 value. That's it. And they were saying, well, if we reduce the average number of person-to-person contacts, stay at home, social distancing, school closures, travel, all of those, that's one way of doing it. The other is to reduce transmission during contacts. So that's the masks, maybe hand sanitizer, disinfectants, those bizarre plastic sheets that they put at the checkouts of the groceries, that the grocers, you know, the person at the till is taking your groceries, handing it back to you, but the virus doesn't know to go, they can't go through the glass. Largely mechanistic. Okay, now, so here the thing is, we saw earlier, Flaxman et al. Said, oh, but they worked. They saved all of these lives because our model said so. Well, what about other people that were just trying to see it? Like, this is Simon Wood. He's a statistician in Scotland, and he was saying, well, actually, there's problems with, won't get into too much of the details, but there's problems with the cases, particularly in the beginning, because they were increasing testing capacity for the first 6 months. So the number of new cases was a function of how many tests they were doing, which, makes sense. So he'd say, but the deaths were more reliable, but you have to lag for it. So when he did that, he noticed that in the UK, the first wave was already in decline before any of the interventions took into place. That curve was already going down beforehand. Now, it was a straightforward analysis. It was slow walked. He submitted his paper 5th of May 2020 as a preprint. He didn't get it published till March 30th, 2021, which is kind of too late at that stage. So that's, we noticed, was happening a lot. And then this is just another one. This is a shout out. I've heard of this through Ivor Cummins, who was doing some good. He's a YouTube Irish-based guy. But he found this graph comparing North Dakota and South Dakota that had very different interventions during the first wave. Different governors and different policies. Can you see which one is which? They're all, there's slight differences. They're almost the same. Different measures, same outcome. Okay? Now, well, if it's not the interventions, well, what could it be? So this is my colleagues. We did this paper 2024. I talked about this in last year's talk. we said, could seasonality be a factor? Because cold and flu, because SARS-CoV-2 is a beta coronavirus. And there are other beta coronaviruses. That 4 of them are endemic coronaviruses that account for 10 to 20% of what we call the cold. You got a common cold. That's possibly you've gotten that. And statistically, every one of us here, we have all caught the 4 endemic coronaviruses probably multiple times in our lives. And we get it, more likely to get it during the cold and flu season. You can still get summer colds, it's still possible, but there's this massive peak. So what we did is Stockholm had been routinely monitoring the incidence every week of these different coronaviruses for the 10 years before COVID. So we asked for the data and we said maybe we could use that as a proxy for what you might expect a seasonality, a crude proxy, but what would it do? And so what we found is this red dash line, I don't know if you can see that, we're just looking here at Sweden, the paper we look at all 6 countries, but you can see this red dash line is what you'd expect from seasonality. This is what was actually observed, the brown curve, and you can see all of the peaks occurred cold and flu season. And all of the troughs occurred in the summers. And so this shows a very good relationship we found for all 6 countries and different metrics of it. But then we said, well, what about the NPIs? We couldn't find a clear or consistent signal for this or for the vaccinations. It seemed to be seasonal. Now, to get it published, we had to say, of course, we're just talking about 6 Northern European countries, and we cannot extrapolate from that to the rest of the world. Okay, fine, that's it. But NPIs, they actually caused harm as well. If you recall, the idea of NPIs was to save granny. That was the way it was like summarized. You know, it was like, oh, because COVID has a higher risk with age. The older you are, the more likely you are to get severe COVID. But if you're younger, it's just mild. It's very statistically, and I talked about this in a previous talk. But like the thing is, was a strange, bizarre inversion of societal norms where the most at-risk groups was the elderly. The least at-risk groups was the young. And so the young were being asked to sacrifice their quality of life to save the elderly, which is a strange societal inversion. But did it actually work? Well, you see, the problem is, so this is a nice study in Sweden. They interviewed nursing home residents, and they point out the reality is that if you go, the most at-risk groups was the elderly. There was also high obesity, that's a separate thing, but the elderly was a thing. If you go, in Sweden in particular, if you go into a nursing home, it's usually because either cognitive decline or physical decline. And so a lot of people, it is their last, most residents, that is their last destination. And so the average the median life expectancy in Stockholm's nursing homes was 5 to 9 months. So if the NPIs worked, then it extended their life by 5 to 9 months. That's what we were talking about. That's what all of this have to done. But this is quite a hard to read one by Giebel et al. And they interviewed different visitors, and this is the title of the paper. It sums it up, because talking about, you remember in the nursing homes, they were introducing things like you could have Zoom conferences, or you could meet your relative through a screen. And so this, one of the wife of a patient who passed away said, because if I don't hold his hand, then I might as well not be there. Okay? So that's what we were saving. That's what the children were sacrificing their childhood years for. And what happened to the kids? Mental health problems, increases in the things. We also had children spending less time on physical activity and more time on screens. And there's so many other impacts from the education. My nephews that spend a lot of their time in school watching through a screen, things like this. It'll take years to figure out all of the impacts, not just for the elderly and the young, but everyone in between. So we did a paper, non-pharmaceutical interventions. So that's basically everything like lockdowns, the masks, anything that doesn't involve, any COVID policy that doesn't involve a intervention. That's a non-pharmaceutical intervention, and it's NPI for short. And we did this paper here, and we don't have time to go into it, but we just look at, it's 40 pages, 193 references. These are the different sections we look at, and you could do a whole talk on each one of those. But I just want to summarize it with, public health is more than one virus, okay? So our conclusion too, and our recommendation too, we could say conservatively, the NPIs were much less effective than thought. Can we agree on that? And then the other thing is that they may have had unintended adverse public health impacts. We're trying to be diplomatic, but that's and conservative, but I think that's fair enough. So I would say, if they're ever coming in, holistic health impact assessments are essential. Not just focusing on one virus. Yes, look at the virus, but look at all of public health, okay? And then methods for objectively assessing their effectiveness should be continuously scrutinized. That's the same point as the models. Don't just rely on the models. Now, my talk I gave last year was basically on this quote by Hippocrates, which, so I don't have time to read through it all, but that the main problem tree was we were looking at the pharmaceutical interventions, and we noticed this odd asymmetry between the two classes. One was the potential use of cheap repurposed drugs with well-known safety profiles. And so we'll talk about one of them in a moment. If you did that, you were vilified, actively suppressed and vilified. The other one is, we have this brand new technology, and to this day, a lot of people still think COVID-19 vaccines, the mRNA, it's a vaccine. Vaccines are good. Vaccines save lives. This is just another one. It's just a COVID. No, it's not. Now, I'll put in this other thing. That US, most of the West, was forced to do the only vaccines that were considered viable were either the mRNA, so Pfizer, Moderna, or the DNA, which is AstraZeneca or Johnson & Johnson. But they were not the only WHO approved ones. The Chinese had developed Sinopharm, Sinovac, sometimes called Pharm and CoronaVac. They were WHO approved at the same time. They were an inactivated vaccine. They were actually a conventional vaccine. They were equally as safe and effective, they were equally as effective according to the clinical trials. I would say equally ineffective. But they had the same results. The WHO said that works, but you weren't allowed to do it. You could only use this mRNA or DNA ones, which is very, very odd and inconsistent with WHO policies. But you couldn't question it. So let's just talk about the first one, which is the repurposed drugs. The ivermectin. WHO have this living guideline on drugs for them, and they keep updating it. But ivermectin, you may have heard of. The CNN like to call it horse dewormer, because it's so widespread. It has both veterinary applications and human applications. Okay, go figure. But the WHO says we recommend not to use ivermectin except in the context of a clinical trial. Because of that one line, nobody was doing it. If you used it, if you were a doctor, you prescribed it, you got into trouble. If you were a patient, you couldn't get it for love or money. And so what was this very definitive thing? It says, well, the effects of ivermectin remain uncertainty because of very low certainty of evidence. Okay, what does that mean? Well, okay, so high degree of uncertainty. Okay, what they did is they said they identified 16 randomized controlled trials of ivermectin. But they said, well, we're only interested in the 5 that directly compared ivermectin with standard of care and reported mortality. Okay, fair enough. So what was the result of those 5? Well, this is a bit messy if you're not used to this. This is called a forest plot. So I don't know if you can see the straight line there. Can you all see that straight line in the middle? That's if you're to the left, that favours ivermectin. That means ivermectin is better than standard of care. If it's on the right, that disfavours it. It's better to take standard of care than ivermectin. So the thing is, when they average together all 5 of them, this is what they got. Now, I don't know if you can see that, but this little diamond is to the left of the thing. It favours it. So specifically, the average risk reduction, 0.36, the risk ratio, 0.36, 36% less likely to have severe outcomes if you took ivermectin on average. But the error bar goes 0.17 to 0.75. And it's like, oh, why was this uncertainty? Oh, 2 of these 5 RCTs, 2 were at high risk of bias due to inadequate blinding. Okay, fair enough. So what happens if you remove them? Well, you end up with this diamond. But actually, I don't know if you can see it here, but actually the average still has a risk ratio of 0.77, which is less than 1. So then they're saying on average, we exclude it. It shows that it reduces your chances of having severe outcomes. So why did they do it? Because now the error bar spans 1. So it goes from 0.28 to 2.18. So the conclusion is ivermectin probably reduces is good for you. But we can't rule out the possibility that it might be worse. Okay. Did you understand that? That's what the WHO statement is. Now, this is from, this is my colleague, Jerry put this together. This is another paper we're working on. But it's the WHO data. He just plotted it to give a better one. And he put it here, ivermectin, remdesivir, HCQ versus standard of care. And this is mortality, hospitalization, ventilation. Okay, so what he's saying is, you can see, look, for all results, the average for ivermectin is less than 100%, so it's actually effective. But the error bars, that's it. That's what they're saying. Because of the error bars, nobody should do this. This is dangerous horse dewormer because of that. Now, here's the odd thing, inconsistency again, that remdesivir, the WHO actually recommended it for certain purposes. They were prescribing remdesivir in situations. But remdesivir's error bars span the same as well. So that's what we're saying. So what we're saying is the suppression of results into that, disquieting, okay, especially for HCQ and ivermectin that have been widely used for decades for well-established safety profiles. And here's the bottom line. Could they not at least allow the right to try? You know, that's it. With a physician looking at, let's try and take you off if it's not working. No, it was because of that. So that's what we were saying. So now, but what about the one that was allowed? This wonderful safe and effective vaccine. Well, they said, this is interesting. This is the VAERS database. Was set up in 1990. It's for the US, co-managed by CDC and FDA. Now, it's well known. It relies on voluntary submission by healthcare providers. And it's a lot of work to submit a report. So it's known that there's a major under-reporting bias, but we just don't know how much. But I don't know. This is the total number of deaths for all vaccines that were contributed. And I don't know if any of you can spot a pattern, because I can't, the WHO can't either. But anyway, there does seem to be, I don't know if you get a slight spike up there. Okay, 2021. But what could that be? Well, look, that was all. This is percentage of deaths reported to VAERS associated with each of the different vaccines. 91% of, since 1990, of all deaths logged on the VAERS database are associated with the COVID-19 vaccines. Now, associated, it's just somebody said the patient died after the vaccine. Maybe it's related. Okay. You could say, well, maybe. Well, you might argue, 25 days, maybe it's not. But look at this. The majority were on the same day of vaccination. or 1 day after, 2 days after. This is like, I think, correlation doesn't prove causation, but it does look like maybe there was something there. But apparently the WHO disagrees, because if you recall from Watson et al., in 2021 alone, they saved at least 14.4 million lives. They also say serious reactions to COVID-19 vaccines are extremely rare. Now, but like, how rare is rare? Now, people have seen my previous talk. I've robbed a few slides from this, but I think it's worth just going through them again, because this is so important. What is rare? Now, so in pharmacovigilance, which drug safety, they have these definitions of what is rare, and it's a frequency. But I'll put in this caveat, that's a conservative one, because with drugs, with a vaccine, you're giving it to a healthy population. So you want it to be even safer. You want lower risk. But let's just use that. Very rare, less than 1 in 10,000. Well, Bard et al., they went and they conceded Pfizer led to very rare cases, 2.7 per 100,000. Okay, but then they put in this little thing, but actually there's a higher risk of myocarditis from COVID itself. And you will hear this claim still repeated to this day. But it came down from bad statistics, is the best analysis, the most charitable, I could say, sloppy science. Because you remember I was saying the early months there was inadequate testing. So they were, the number of COVID case infections in the first waves was dramatically underestimated. When you correct for that 11 per 100,000 just disappears. And here's another better example. This was Levu et al. Looking at everyone in France under the age of 50 from May to October 2021. 1 in 10,000 people developed myocarditis or pericarditis in this period. And 97% of those cases, they could directly link them causally to, or temporarily, that occurred after the vaccine. So I'd notice as well that this is rare rather than very rare, okay? And now here's the next thing, the COVID-19 safety and efficacy clinical trials by Pfizer and Moderna. They had all of these things. I don't have time to get into all of the details, but the bottom line is Freeman et al. Were able to get hold of the actual reports that were given in the clinical trials. And then they looked to see for what are called serious adverse events of special interest during the clinical trials, this 2 to 3 month trials that led to this is safe for everybody. They found that roughly 1 in 800 in the vaccine arm had a serious adverse events of special interest. Had you heard of that? Do you think Pfizer and Moderna should have mentioned that? Well, that's it. And so that's not rare or very rare. It's uncommon, by the way. But here's this other one. This is for a high school in Thailand. They were about to take the second Pfizer dose. And so this group of researchers said, let's just study them before and after and look at everything, throw everything in the kitchen sink at them and look at the cardiograms, cardiac enzymes. What they found is nearly 30% of the boys and girls had some form of temporary cardiovascular manifestation after taking their second dose. That's not normal, okay? Now, it's temporary. 3.5% of the boys developed subclinical or mild myopericarditis. Now, here's the thing. And by the way, that's similar results were replicated with later studies in other high schools. But I don't know that maybe CNN didn't think that was newsworthy. Okay, but I'd also put in the caveat. This is another example that the authors, you could see, they were forced to pressurize and say, but of course, it was all temporary and everyone recovered and it was mild. Okay, but still, that's it. Okay, Rasmussen reports, I also gave this in the previous talk, but they've done these surveys and they do believe, now this is the public, these are not pathologists or clinical microbiologists. They can't do it. It's just general people. This is public opinion in the US. 7% of people in the US believe that they experienced a major side effect from the vaccine. And only 56% said that they didn't experience it. Now, this is even more disturbing. And now, again, they're not pathologists, so they don't know. But has any member of your household died? Member of your household died whose death you think may have been caused by side effects? 10%. Now, they're not pathologists, okay? Do you know someone personally who died from side effects of the COVID-19 vaccine? 19%. Now again, they're not pathologists, okay? But that's what they personally believe. And for the record, I would be in that 19%, except I'm not in the US, but so it's like, that should be investigated further. It's what we would call a safety signal. It doesn't mean that it is true. It could have been something else. It could have been conspiracy or coincidence. But anyway, I don't really have time to go into this question of did they actually work. I will say, I did in the previous talk, but you will find people saying these observational studies, they said, oh, we looked at the vaccinated population and the unvaccinated and we show that it was very effective, okay? And what I would say is if you see any of those papers, have a look. I'd start with Fung et al. 2024. There's a lot of papers on this. They show every single one of the papers that they looked at that showed observational studies showed a effectiveness. There was statistical flaws that completely made the results spurious, okay? And I'll just give you an example. On Twitter, or X as they call it, a few weeks ago, someone was sharing this story about COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy linked to increased risk of traffic accidents. Individuals who disregard recommendations for vaccination against COVID may also disregard rules of road safety. Wow. Oh, these are dangerous people, right? Okay, well, yeah, Redelmeyer et al. This is a genuine scientific study, Redelmeyer et al. What they did is, they went to Ontario, Canada. There was nearly 7,000 traffic accidents during their study period. And so they looked and they had the vaccine status of it and they divided into the vaccinated, unvaccinated, and said, oh, actually, there's a higher risk of being in a traffic accident if you are unvaccinated. Well, what they the problem is, they only studied up to July 2021. I don't know if you recall, this was DC, this is just after BC. You had going from started with the most elderly and healthcare workers all the way up to, by summer, they had started allowing the younger generations to get the vaccine. But that means there's a strong risk of age bias. And sure enough, the unvaccinated group, only 12% were over the age of 65 and 51% were under 40. And you get the reverse for that. And Redelmeyer et al. Acknowledge in one of their tables, they say, before COVID, there is a known statistical risk. If you're under 40, you're 50% more likely to be in a car accident. If you're over 65, 38% less. So that's where that result comes. And another way you could do this, if you actually look at their table, they actually show that the risk for unvaccinated was the same, almost the same, for the drivers and the passengers. Okay, so if you are an unvaccinated driver, you might try and pick up a vaccinated passenger just to save your life, Okay, so just to wrap this one up, the vaccines here, what I would say is, researchers should be encouraged to critically evaluate claims that a particular vaccine is safe and effective without the fear of potentially being labelled as anti-vax or anti-science. I've just got to say this because there's a lot of pressure over the years campaigning to say the vaccines are safe and effective totally, and you cannot ask any questions about that at all. Okay, all pharmaceutical, every drug is neither 100% safe nor 100% effective. Even paracetamol. Okay, so why is it that this one class, you're not allowed to even just ask a question? Could it be maybe 90 instead of 95? That's odd. That's not scientific. That's odd. So we should be doing this. Now, what happened? We had segregation. We had the return of separate drinking fountains, effectively, for the good vaccinated versus the filthy unvaccinated. Okay, but then by the end of 2021, they started these booster campaigns. So suddenly, the good boys and girls, if you didn't get your booster, oh, you're not good anymore. Okay. But then by mid-2022, pretty much most people got COVID a couple of times. You know, a lot of people, the majority, let's say, especially during Omicron. So then it didn't matter whether you did a vaccine or not. So they said, oh, now it's the boosters will reduce severity. Well, a lot of people started getting a bit skeptical. I don't know, like these comedians, Dana Carvey and David Spade. Does that work? How do I click that? Whoop.
I miss COVID.
I know. Dude, you know when I knew there was trouble? When anyone that came to our country didn't have to get a vaccine. And I go, if you're telling me I can't go to work, but everyone coming in doesn't have to get one, I go,
well, once we found out, when Fauci said, okay, I'm sorry, if you've had 2 boosters and 2 vaccines, you can get and give COVID to another guy who's had 5 vaccines and 4 boosters. What's the difference between a vaccine and a booster? I don't know, just more vaccine, but booster sounds better. Anyway, a guy with 25 vaccines would get and give COVID to another guy with 25 vaccines. That's why I'm introducing the daily COVID shot. Every day you get a shot. By the time you get to your car, you got no immunity. But it's a beautiful 39 seconds. I miss COVID.
Okay. Right, okay. So what we just say is by the end of within a year, it was obvious they weren't doing reducing viral transmission. They weren't stopping viral transmission. If you remember, the SEER model the plan was everybody needs to get it because you'll go straight S to V. That was then debunked. So then you would say it's no longer needed for population-wide. But then the other thing is we're now seeing, let's just say, non-trivial risks of serious adverse reactions. So that should be in a part. And the other thing is the use of mandates and other measures to nudge people have ethical problems. And just at Hippocrates, we'll just say, we appreciate pharmaceutical products are to be given mass to the whole population, and the National Health Services are design policies at a national level. But the reality is it is paramount importance that we ensure that patients and physicians are allowed to work together to develop personal healthcare pathways individually designed for the circumstances of each patient. And then the final section problem is on the misinformation. Now, I have this quote that I found: I would rather have questions that cannot be answered than answers that cannot be questioned. I really like that quote, and I appreciate it. Now, who is it? Apparently, it's Feynman, according to the internet, because you find this thing going around. Now, I've checked it up. No, it turns out, it doesn't seem to be him. It seems to be anonymous, somebody on the internet. So I've replaced that here with this nice quote I found from Abraham Lincoln. Don't believe everything you read on the internet just because there's a picture with a quote next to it. But whoever said it, I agree with it. Now, so what we'll say is, in the paper, we go through the censorship and self-censorship comes from, in detail, through different factors. We look at the role of the public, the media, social media platforms, fact-checking organizations, government officials, pharmaceutical industry, and the scientific community itself. And I finish up with just talking about this Great Barrington Declaration, which I don't know how familiar you are with it, but these were 3 epidemiologists, Harvard, Oxford, and Stanford. And at the 4th of October 2020, they met at Great Barrington, Massachusetts, and they said, hey, maybe there's something wrong with locking down the entire population, given that we know that there is the risk of severe COVID has a very well-defined profiles. Maybe we should be looking at focused protection or considering it or having a discussion. And so freedom of information, it's been found out that 4 days later, the then director of NIH was Francis Collins, was emailing Fauci and Tabak saying, this proposal from the 3 fringe epidemiologists, Harvard, Oxford, and Stanford, of course, those dodgy universities, and even a co-signature from Nobel Prize winner. Okay, there needs to be a quick and devastating published takedown of its premise. That ended up with the Jon Snow memorandum. But a week later, on October the 10th, a Saturday, I decided, I heard about this, I'll better look it up. So I tried to find a website. On Google, it was all hit pieces. So I went to the second page, hit pieces, third page, and there was the thing. Who goes to the third page on Google, okay? Now you'd say, maybe it wasn't search engine optimized. Well, no. If you went to DuckDuckGo, it was on the front page, and they even put up a little call-out box, and same with on Bing. Google were being told to intentionally alter the rankings, to shove the thing onto the third page where nobody looks, and to promote anything criticizing it. Now, but there is maybe a cause of optimism, because now that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is the Secretary of Department of Health and Human Services, he's now put in this. So 2 of those fringe epidemiologists, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya is now the director of the NIH, and Dr. Martin Kulldorff is now a co-chair on the ACIP. And another possible cause of optimism, I got into trouble from YouTube for saying naughty words. I tried to post this, and they said that I was saying something to criticize WHO perspectives, okay, which you're not supposed to do. But it looks like YouTube is loosening. This is the New York Times in a few weeks ago, loosening the moderation of videos. And I could say, yeah, sure enough, you go to their community guidelines, sometime between January and April, they said, we have now retired the remaining standalone COVID-19 policies. So now it's no longer, YouTube has apparently gotten rid of COVID-19 policies. And so finally, our final conclusion recommendation, I would just sum it up with, the best antidote to bad ideas is to counter them with better ideas. Censorship of different scientific opinions does not lead to better scientific opinions, it leads to weaker scientific conclusions. Okay, sorry if I ran over time, but okay.